Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. I'm with Steve Forbes. Steve, thank you so much for joining us and sitting down with AMTV this morning.
Looking forward to it, thank you.
We watched you speak yesterday. Great speech.
Thank you.
Talked a little bit about your book, Reviving America. In it you talk about reforming the Federal Reserve. What do you mean by that?
Having a stable dollar again, like 60 minutes in an hour, 12 inches in a foot, the dollar should have a stable value. The Fed should cease trying to control the economy a la the Soviet Union through manipulating interest rates. Let borrowers and lenders set the price of money. And in terms of the Fed's bloated portfolio, where it's seized with no permission, $3 trillion of assets, run that portfolio down. When a bond matures, don't renew it. Let the money go back into the lending system to where it can be put to productive use rather than subsidizing government.
Now, you've talked a lot about economic consequences of the policies at the Federal Reserve, 0% interest rates. We are 8 years roughly into the business cycle. The S&P 500 is hitting new all-time highs. What do you think the consequences are of this funny money policy, quantitative easing to infinity, artificial stimulus? I mean, are things going to get bad in America, in your opinion?
Well, things are not good for America in terms of small business creation, new business creation. You look at flows of credit to small and new businesses and households, which are the real dynamic actors in the economy, so to speak. They're being starved of credit. So yes, the market's doing well because big companies are doing well, like they do in Europe. But for the dynamism that you need for the present and for the future, this is not a good thing. This is like eating your feed corn.
Absolutely. Now, we saw you on CNN recently. You said, I believe, quote, that you support the GOP presumptive nominee, Donald Trump. Is that an official endorsement?
I said I would support the nominee, and I'll support the nominee.
Okay, fair enough. Do you think he can win? If Donald Trump is the nominee coming up to the convention here next week, can he win? Is he capable of beating Hillary Rodham Clinton?
Really, the question is, will Trump blow it? This election is for Trumps to lose. Most people don't want a third term. Most people don't want a continuation of what's happened in the last decade. And so if Trump doesn't make mistakes, runs a good campaign, comes out with some good policy statements, he will win. Hillary Clinton was severely damaged, even though that wasn't the intent by the FBI and the Justice Department rigging that email investigation so that she didn't get indicted as any other human being would have been.
Glad you brought that up because we have a very libertarian, liberty-oriented audience. And there's a lot of anger that Hillary Clinton was able to get away with criminal activity. You know, I'm a regular guy. If I committed, that activity, they'd prosecute me. If I was found guilty in a court of law, I'd potentially go to jail. I couldn't get away with it. We saw James Comey, the director of the FBI, basically not do anything and waver around the whole idea that, well, we don't think she had intent. She was just negligent, so we're not going to prosecute. Even though she built a private email server, had a major infrastructure set up.
Two things on that. One is Comey did not have to make a statement. His task was to investigate. That report should have gone to the Attorney General to make the decision whether you prosecute or not. So that's part of why people think it's a rigged system. He, in effect, said, I don't think there's anything here, whereas anybody who read that report would have said, wow. There's an indictment, several indictments here. As for intent, she was told, contrary to what she said, she lied on this too, as so many other things she's done on. She lied about the warnings from the State Department that this was not the right thing to do. So what they call mens rea in law, intent, goes by the boards. She was told, period.
Do you think the meeting with Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch in Phoenix is our neck of the woods? Do you think that was intentional? I kind of feel that they put that out to the media for a reason, to relieve her from basically any accountability of potentially prosecuting or bringing charges, as I think is her job to do, because she specifically said, I'm going to defer to the FBI's judgment, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, whether or not they're going to prosecute or bring charges against Hillary. You think anything fishy was going on with that?
Well, would be one thing if you were running through the airport and ran into each other. Quite another having airplanes meet on a runway and people, officials clearing the way, no cameras, no cell phones and things like that. So it was not a coincidence. As they used to say in the Soviet Union, there are no coincidences, comrade. And that's what happened here. I think he, in effect, ambushed her. He didn't have to say anything. Just his presence would remind her. He appointed her in 1999. He started her career trajectory that took her to the top of the Justice Department. And so, yes, it's part of the rigged verdict. Like they used to count votes or still count votes in Chicago. It's not what it should have been.
Should Hillary Clinton be in jail? What are your thoughts?
Well, if she, at the most, if she had a terrific Clarence Darrow type of lawyer, she would have ankle bracelets.
At the very least. Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that. So Donald Trump, you said it's his election to lose, basically. He's going to announce, at least this is what we've been hearing, as soon as tomorrow, who the VP pick is. Who do you think he should pick? Newt's been a standout. You know, I've looked at some preliminary polling. The Drudge Report, I think, indicated over 50% of just that loose poll was in favor, favoring Newt Gingrich. Do you think he's a good option, or do you think it should be somebody else?
Well, Donald Trump never goes according to script. So the fact that Newt's at the top of the list almost guarantees it won't happen.
Probably. Yeah, that's an excellent point, actually.
And it could be Mike Pence, who sort of was like the dark horse rushing up in a horse race, where others got tired out. He zooms by. And it could be somebody, he may just choose somebody who's not on his supposed short list. That's why people listening to Donald, even if they're not going to vote for him, he is always entertaining.
Very entertaining. I think he took a lot of people by surprise, right? I mean, 12 months ago, people were like, Donald Trump, no way he's going to be the presumptive nominee, but the political incorrectness. And I think that's what America wants. I mean, they want real opinion. Do you think Trump, I'm assuming that you two know each other?
Yes.
Are you good friends?
I've known Donald for Trump for 30 years, back when he burst upon the New York real estate scene in the 1980s. And he's always taken us to task at Forbes each year about the estimation of his wealth. He always has it 2 to 3 times what we have it.
Sure.
So we go through that dance each year. And but in terms of the political correctness, people think that is not just corrosive, but as somebody pointed out, they don't like the condescension that comes with it. That you peons don't know what's good for you. And even though we elites have wrecked the economy for a decade, shut up and you're always guilty. You're always guilty.
Sure. Now, knowing Trump, because he's so larger than life, he's this character. You're fired. You know, Donald, everyone knows him from the Apprentice. Is that how he really is in person as a friend, knowing him? Is he the same guy in real life?
Well, Donald Trump, as they like to say, is the only person who fired people who didn't work for him. And but in terms of, he can be very charming. He can combine good cop, bad cop in one if he's got
smart, I think.
Oh, no question about it. And two things helped him. One is people already knew him. He had higher name recognition than anybody else, including Jeb Bush, by a wide margin. They'd seen him on TV in a role as an authoritative figure. Very critical. People trying to win his favor because he was the guru. Then, in terms of the political incorrectness, people were sick of that, and they went with it. And because they felt they knew him, when the criticisms came, they had a point of reference, whereas most other candidates, they're not that well known except in a very, very vague way. So Trump had that advantage. The other big advantage he had was that he built buildings.
Something real.
So politicians make speeches. Whatever you say about them, buildings rose up. That just doesn't happen. Somebody has to make it happen. So people figure out maybe this, maybe that, but the buildings rose up. The courses got built.
Sure. And I think Americans can relate to that. You know, even though Donald Trump's very.
And as you say, even more than software, buildings you can touch. They're tangible. You see them.
Absolutely. So it seems like a lot of the GOP party doesn't like Trump, right? Jeb Bush, for example, will not endorse him. will not support him, and he says he's not going to vote for Hillary, but by not supporting and endorsing Donald Trump, he's essentially voting for Hillary Clinton, at least in a lot of people's minds, or half a vote, right? So, I mean, what do you think about why is the GOP party so reluctant to endorse the people's choice? I mean, this is a representative government. I mean, what are your thoughts? Is that the right thing to do?
Well, people have very serious questions about his principles, his philosophy, his consistency, his temperament. That's what he's got to, those doubts he has to deal with in the campaign. And for example, I don't agree with him on a 45% sales tax on imports. I think that would be a disaster. So I have very real reservations about that. In terms of immigration, we're not going to deport 11 million people.
So I wanted to ask you that. Do you think if he becomes president, will he build a wall? I mean, because he better, because that's what he's promised Americans. Is that even possible? And you said he's not going to deport, 13 million plus? Is that even reasonable?
Well, he's now sort of backing off on the deportation, and which everyone knew from the get-go. But in terms of the wall, he will do something, but he's got to change the focus. And people, a lot of his supporters, don't really expect a big wall to be built. They expect things to be done. Areas have more officials there, more helicopters, more technology, and so they expect more action. But building, the Israelis built walls, but that was not on this scale in terms of the specific area they're trying to keep terrorists out, be able to control the flow of people. So, and a lot of his supporters, they say, well, they don't expect the whole thing to be built, but they get his intent that he's going to do something on immigration. That's the key thing. Not the specific remedy, but it's going to be different than what we had before.
Geopolitical tensions seem to be rising around the world, whether or not you look at Russia or China, and you see a lot of this economic movement with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a counterpoint to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, long dominated by the West. Question being, do you think Donald Trump would be a good wartime president? Does he have the strength, knowledge, know-how, experience to lead a nation during a crisis and potentially a global war, which people think this stuff can't happen, but history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it has a tendency to rhyme. What are your thoughts on his ability to lead in an environment like that if the worst case scenario played out in the future?
Well, one of the things he has to deal with are doubts about temperament. Does he have the temperament for the job? Everyone knows crises are going to come up that no one anticipated. No one anticipated in 2000 we'd have 9/11 and crisis since then. So the question is, does this person have the temperament to deal with it? That's one of the things he has to deal with. That's why, just as a starter, releasing those 11 names of potential Supreme Court justices, they all passed muster. These were people of substance. And as VP pick, same thing. Will that allay doubts? He may come up with other names of the kinds of people he wants around him as a team. Those things are going to play more critical importance because he's new. He's thrown a lot of balls in the air. He's shot off a lot of cannons. And so people want reassurance that when it comes to big decisions, they'll be deliberate, there'll be a method, and you have people there who have had experience in dealing with these things, so he'll come up with a considered decision. And if he does that, he's going to be very hard to stop. Even though his negatives are higher than those of Hillary Clinton, they're not yet frozen. Her negatives are now frozen. It's going to be very hard for her to chip away, which is why they're just going to go after Donald Trump. There's no way that people are going to say, even though she lied about the emails, she's really a trustworthy person. That's gone.
So really is a third term of Barack Obama, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, that's the thing. People don't want a third term. So that's why it's for Trump's to lose.
Now, there's been a lot of talk. I really think it's propelled by the mainstream media, but there's kind of this divide and conquer with race relations right now. Of course, we've had 2 tragic shootings of young African-American men. They're really kind of putting this race narrative out to the public, which is interesting. At the same time, Hillary Clinton had a spotlight on her for only about 24 hours regarding the FBI Director Comey investigation. Said they just quickly moved away from it. But the question being, do you think that racism exists in America today? You really think that's a problem? Why are people so angry? Why is there all this divisiveness right now in American politics? I mean, what's your take on it?
The basic divisiveness and anger comes from a stagnant economy. People feeling that we can't get out of the rut. And as we discuss in our book, Reviving America, when you have an unstable currency, social tensions rise because social trust is undermined. And as Keynes said, not one in a million will understand what is going on. Money is how we deal with strangers. Money is based on trust. It has no intrinsic value. Pieces of paper, lips on a computer, token coins. And when that trust is undermined, it reverberates throughout society. And so I think this is part of it. If you look at the facts, as Larry Elder did at this conference yesterday, he pointed out that in the last 40 years, shootings of blacks by police are down 75%.
And that's a fact.
That's fact. And so the narratives, I think, reflect not facts so much as frustration. Why aren't things moving? And also, it's because they're not facing up. Why are some people not having a better opportunity to get ahead? Well, if you start dealing with that, you're going to have to deal with the teachers' union. Don't want to do it. You have to start dealing with culture. Government can't do it. That's something people have to do. So there are issues that people don't want to discuss or touch for political reasons. The economy's not going anywhere with the vigor that it should. You look around the world, things seem to be falling apart. I mean, Russia is now harassing our diplomats, not only in Russia, but in Europe. That's outrageous. And Kerry says, I'm going to bring that up with the No.
I think there was an NBC executive, there was some kind of media executive that was held in Moscow, too, I think, for several hours and interrogated.
It's all our contempt for Barack Obama. Chinese, even though they got an adverse ruling on the South China Sea, no, you don't own that. Your claims are flimsy. China feels that it can go ahead. And so what I think upsets people, and Hillary Clinton can't get around it, she headed up the foreign policy ship for 4 years, is the world is falling apart and the U.S. is not respected. Not in a Tarzan sense, but it's not seen as a serious player.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, a lot of people criticize Vladimir Putin, for example, Russia, and I think it's fair to criticize him, but he's also respected. I mean, his people, if you believe the polls, I mean, he's got tremendous support, at least, you know, some of the polling. But so how do we reinstill that respect? Does it come through leadership, through potentially, you know?
Well, the conclusion's very simple. Just look at what Reagan did in terms of a change of spirit. Reform, getting the economy moving. This country has a massive amount of entrepreneurial potential waiting to be released. People start to see this economy moving, us doing some big things like the tax code. The world's going to take note. America's back in business again. That changes the whole temperament around the world. We make it very clear. We're not going to be pushed out of the China Sea. We're going to have flyovers of those man-made islands. We're going to have maneuvers with the Philippines and others in those waters because they're international waters. And in Europe, you start with, you make it very clear. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are part of NATO. You attack those countries, you're attacking the U.S., period. Case closed. Don't even think of it. As for Ukraine, okay, Ukraine's not going to become part of NATO, but we can provide them starting with a currency board. You get a stable currency in Ukraine, that economy starts to come back. That puts more pressure on the Russians. There's a variety of things that can be done where people will say it's a different world, more positive world.
Sure, I think so. What is your take on the Ukraine intervention? Do you think that was just Putin that, you know, was wielding his force in that area? You think the United States is responsible in that part of the world for kind of agitating, you know, the Russian bear, as the media will call it?
Well, the agitation didn't come from the U.S. or Europe so much as it did from Ukraine. Ukrainians do not want to be a subsidiary, a satellite of Moscow. And so that's, and Putin thought he had paid off $15 billion cost the previous president, thought he had secured Ukraine. and then suddenly it slipped from his fingers. And that's why he started to do what he did. So we make it clear, Ukraine's not going to become part of NATO. Finland isn't part of NATO, but it's part of the EU. Austria is not part of NATO, but it's considered part of Europe. Ukraine can have more trade relations with Europe, more trade relations with the rest of the world, as well as with Russia, since Russia's right next door. So you can make it clear it's not going to be a bone of contention or a big meat of contention. It's a big place in terms of power politics, but it's also not going to be occupied by a foreign power.
What is your take on Middle East policy? You know, we look at Syria, for example. The U.S. has really been trying to push Bashar al-Assad out, at least from my understanding. Over close to 500,000 people have been slaughtered, essentially, which is tough to fathom as a regular guy, that bloodshed as a result of, you know, that destabilization in that part of the world. NATO arguably indirectly took out Muammar Gaddafi, who, you know, was a tyrant, many will argue, but was kind of putting a lid on a lot of that chaos in this part of the world, which is now spilling over into the other countries. Of course, we have the rise of ISIS, which really kind of came from Al-Qaeda. I mean, what do we do from here? What is your take on it? How should the next president handle? I mean, it's why Hillary shouldn't be in office, because, of course, she was Secretary of State during all of this while it was happening. What do we do in this part of the world now? It seems like a disaster.
Well, this is what happens when you have a half-baked foreign policy that's always half-pregnant, tries to be half-pregnant. If you're going to go along with rebels against Gaddafi, all right, what do you do after he's gone? What's your game plan to follow it? With Iraq, we had won in Iraq by 2009. The change in strategy, don't call it a surge. We had plenty of surges in Vietnam, but not a change in strategy. Strategy fundamentally changed in 2007. It worked. So we should have kept a force there to make sure, like we do in Bosnia. Nobody knows there are NATO forces in Bosnia to make sure the Croats and the Serbs and the Muslims don't go after each other. You sit on it and hope a civil society rises up. That's what it should have been done in Iraq. Obama, for political reasons, against the advice of Hillary Clinton, against the advice of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, against the advice of anyone who knew anything about that part of the world, said, keep a force there. It was hard to get it to this point. Keep it. Don't lose it. He threw it away and didn't realize what the consequences would be. In Syria, we're floundering. We don't support our friends, but we don't do anything against our enemies. It was recommended 2 to 3 years ago, which Obama ignored. Set up a safe haven in Syria so refugees can go there, not to Turkey, not to Europe, and destabilize that part of the world. And we did that, in effect, with for the Iraq War. We did that after the 1991 Gulf War. We established a no-fly zone off the Kurdish part of Iraq. They, in effect, set up their own home rule from Saddam, and it worked. We should have done the same thing in Syria. No-fly zone, big geographic area. You go there, no one's going to come after you.
Do you think that America's intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan post-September 11th, George Bush, was justified? Did you agree with that?
He had no choice to go in Afghanistan when the government there sponsored, in effect, the attack on 9/11. The mistake in both Afghanistan and Iraq was that we confused it with Japan and Germany after World War II. You don't remake those societies, you just make sure they're not going to be in a position to incubate things that can harm you. And so in Iraq, we should have kept the forces there once we had gotten that rebellion dealt with. And in Afghanistan, you provide enough resources so the bad guys don't rise up, the Taliban can't rise up. So it's more of a defensive thing. Bad guys, don't think of coming in, but don't think you're going to make Afghanistan post-war Japan. It may arise in a few generations, but the ability to manipulate these things or make these things happen, we've got to learn our limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our audience, because we're social media, and we've got millions of viewers, so they'll ask questions in real time. And one of the questions an audience member asked was, why aren't we at war with Saudi Arabia? because we know now a lot of this financing came from our quote-unquote ally, although the relationships kind of seem to deteriorate recently. We invaded Iraq and Afghanistan post-September 11, but we didn't do anything with Saudi.
The question after 9/11 was, why didn't we take out Iran? They're terrorism central. Hezbollah, Hamas, others get their money and resources via Iran. And while there'd be terrorist forces, if you don't let them reach critical mass, then they become a bloody nuisance, not a threat to destabilize whole countries or whole regions.
Do you think war with Iran is a natural progression from here?
No. Again, with Iran in 2009, they had an uprising, the Green Revolution. They're ready to overthrow the regime. They went to the streets. Obama made it very clear. No verbal support, no other kind of support that we did for solidarity in Poland in the 1980s, nothing. He made it very clear he wouldn't mind them seeing Quash because he thought he was going to have a special relationship with the mullahs. So that was a huge lost opportunity where nature would have taken care of that. And in terms of sanctions, sanctions can bite after a while, as we demonstrated. For example, Iraq gets 40% of its gasoline from India because they don't have the refining capacity. You cut that off, you're given some hurt. The mullahs, many of them are utterly corrupt, like Putin's associates. You start messing around with their bank accounts, they will not be very happy with that. So there's a lot that you can do to indicate seriousness that Iran's not going to be the dominant power. And as for Saudi Arabia, they've tried to buy off everyone. And
OPEC's pretty much deteriorated, arguably, right?
OPEC never was anything anyway. Oil went up when we weakened the dollar. Oil went down when the dollar strengthened. So, but Saudi Arabia could have marginal influence in terms of their output, but in terms of controlling prices, in the 1980s, they did not intend to have it go from 40 down to 10.
Sure, it took everyone by surprise. I mean, even T. Boone Pickens was calling, oh, oil's coming back, it's coming back, and then it didn't come back. I mean, we started to see a little bit of a rally recently, but I think...
So we saw it in the 80s, we saw it in the last few years. And but in terms of Saudi Arabia, this is where the world is never a clean place. They're a natural ally. They're now working with the Israelis. They don't want Iran dominating the Middle East. They don't want a nuclear-armed Iran because they know that means everyone goes under.
Do you think
the Egyptians don't want Iran dominating that part of the world? So you can get a balance where the bad guys don't get predominance, but Obama's made it very clear. He doesn't mind Iran. He will never say it, but body language is more telling sometimes than words. Made it very clear he thinks it's all right for Iran to be the hegemon of the Middle East. And that's what's got everyone saying, are you kidding? Do you know what you're playing with there?
fire, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
And it's not necessary. It's not necessary.
What would you say the biggest risk to America is today, as you see where we are in 2016?
Biggest risk here at home is continuing policies that suppress our natural energy, our ability to innovate. Remember, America, until the last decade, had a faster growth rate than any developed country in the world. Not countries like China catching up, but developed countries. Now, how is that you're the largest economy, but you still grow faster than anybody else? Because we always were having new companies come along, not just small ones, but small that became big. We're constantly renewing that. And so that means that companies don't last forever, but by golly, it makes for a strong economy. So that's a huge threat. If we have a vibrant economy here at home, as Reagan demonstrated, as we demonstrate after World War II, that has reverberations around the world. It's working here. We're back in business. And that just, the sigh of relief around the world would be huge, that we're not in permanent decline.
Now, because Americans are still hurting and there hasn't really been a recovery for the middle class, arguably has kind of stepped down, honestly, since 2008, 2009. And we're in this strange position with Federal Reserve policy where rates are being artificially suppressed. We have negative rates in Europe. What would you do? And I know that these are tough questions and they're complex, but what would you do from here with interest rates, for example? Can the Fed raise them?
Well, for interest rates, most people know rent control doesn't work. Most people know price controls deform markets. What the Fed is doing is deforming credit markets, the financial markets, by trying to control the price of money that lenders lend to borrowers. And when you do that, you get very strange results. Apple finds it very cheap to borrow. It doesn't need the money. But because it's giveaway, why not borrow it and buy in stock? Not the best use of capital. Exxon, same thing. So let it free. Announce May 1st, or what are we now in July? Say Labor Day. All off. People will set the rates like they do set for price free. Wow.
That's an amazing thought, right? Supply and demand, peaks and troughs, an economic cycle, right?
Well, so that would have a very healthy impact. Again, have the Fed stop building up, keeping this bloated portfolio. Stop over-regulating banks where they look over their shoulder if they're going to make a loan to a dry cleaner or finance somebody's inventory. The regulation is very simple. You have certain capital requirements. If you go down, you go out. And if you're very big, it takes time to break you up, but it's doable without destroying the world. And so you do that. And in terms of the economy, it would come back very quickly once you remove these artificial constraints. On salaries, what's one of the reasons why salaries aren't going up? Because people think of salaries as cash. Healthcare is counted as part of your compensation, but it's like barter. It's in kind. So if you have more patient control, more free markets in healthcare, that you'll get, like you have anywhere else, more for less, more productivity, more creation of healthcare, and this big burden would reverse itself. Healthcare would go from a liability to a huge growth industry.
We've all seen our healthcare costs go up. Anyone with a family knows that.
It's not a coincidence that the two areas that just seem to rise like a force of nature: healthcare, no free markets; education, very little free markets. Very telling what you get. Pay more, get less. Does anyone really think today that many undergraduate courses and undergraduate programs are better today than they were 20 years ago, even though tuitions have tripled? Don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. If we let the free market run, something I would agree with.
Free markets are free people. Markets are people. Never forget that.
Does the bubble pop, though, if, let's say, we let the market run now, because it's been artificially created and rates have been suppressed, and we've had QE and they've spent billions of dollars buying more? I mean, what is there just going to be a severe collapse as a result of that, or do they have to keep rates here forever?
No. In terms of any bubbles, if you get any, they go away very quickly. If you make a stable dollar, i.e. related to gold, if you have a simple tax code, you get more patient control of health care, by golly, you'll see capital pouring in this country. Money supply is often determined. You look at Switzerland. Switzerland has a huge money supply. If you look just at the numbers, you say, God, they're having hyperinflation. No, because they know how to manage their currency. People want to hold it. So the supply goes, so people want to hold a sound currency, so the supply goes up. It's a nice currency to have. The dollar, even all the abuses we have put on the dollar, it's still much more useful than Argentine pesos or Brazilian reals. And so there's demand for it. 80% of our current currency is outside the country. And contrary to what the statists say, it's not all drug and all that kind of stuff. Transactions are done in dollars because they don't trust the local currency. They trust us more than the locals.
Venezuela, for example, they're trading diapers for food.
When you destroy your currency, people resort to barter.
Steve, pleasure. Thank you so much for sitting down with this. How does our audience get your book?
They can get the book, Reviving America. They can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get me at the bookstore. But with electronics, you can get it very quickly now. And you get it even quicker, by the way, if the government would allow people like Amazon to use drones the way other companies around the world use drones to make deliveries. So you get it in a matter of hours if the government would just get up to speed in terms of new technology.
Have you heard of Pokemon Go, the new viral video game? Are you playing it?
There's an example of why often it's outsiders that make the big breakthroughs. In this case, the company resisted having something that could work on mobile devices instead of the traditional consoles. They finally were browbeaten into it, and now the stock is zooming.
Yeah, Nintendo stock is doing very well. Well, thank you, Steve. I'm Christopher Green. This is Steve Forbes. You've been tuning into AMTV, alternative media television, hard-hitting and in your face.